Let's get on with part 3 of when Venus came close to Earth. Before we go further, I wanted to really quickly point out that this little series here, whatever this ends up being, this is very much a Velikovskian point of view. Everything I'm saying here, I'm not saying like this is the definitive version of the story. Velikovsky goes to great lengths to state his case and then back it up. And he does that really well. There are aspects of his stories that even he admits to that, he doesn't, there are parts missing, let's put it like that. And there's going to be parts missing because of the events that were transpiring, and, this happened a few thousand years ago. So there's going to be details missing. I didn't want anyone watching these and listening to these videos believe that, hey, this is the ultimate end-all be-all discussion, or the story. Because that's not the case. What has happened since Velikovsky did what he did with all of his books is that other people have since then taken up the torch and they've gone further with it. And there are people that have done this that do disagree with Velikovsky, and there's aspects that I disagree with Velikovsky in as well. The issue there, though, is that all those sides, they're incorporating what evidence they have, and we do have newer evidences nowadays, but there's still a lot of holes in their theories as well. And once again, nobody here claims that they've got the story worked out. I wanted to let everybody know that it's still on us to read all of these theories that are coming together, looking for information, presenting evidence, and use our critical thinking capabilities against all of them to help build a better story, help build a better picture of what happened. Because we're a long way from fully understanding all the events that happened. And we also have a lot working against us, right? The establishment is not helping us. Let's put it like that. It does seem that there is quite a large movement to try to make sure that stuff like this does not get attention. So we're working against a lot of things. Anyway, we'll continue here talking about Velikovsky's perspective. I'm going to keep reading some from his Worlds in Collisions book. He also has several other works out there, by the way, like Ages and Chaos. They're all really good stuff. Some are kind of heavy on the biblical side of the story, which corresponds with all kinds of other stories over there, so that's fine. But they can be difficult reads in the sense of, man, there's all kinds of names and everything in there, but still very detailed reads. Alright, let's move on with the next part of Worlds in Collision. Now, in this part of the story, what we have going on, just to do a quick recap, is Velikovsky discussing the first of two major approaches by the planet Venus, while Venus is in a different orbit. It is in an orbit that has been intruding on Earth's own orbit, but at this point in time, the two planets are now close enough to where they are now interacting electrically. Venus is now shedding charge. I don't know what was happening to the Earth, from outside looking at the Earth. We don't have that perspective. That would actually be something very interesting to try to figure out. What did Earth look like when all of these interactions were going on? We don't have that third-person perspective. So at this point, Venus has started shooting off its cometary tail. It's shedding charge, and Earth is starting to run into the comet, or run into the debris that Venus is shedding off of its planet's surface. This section is called Hail of Stones. Following the red dust, a small, like ashes of the furnace, fell in all the land of Egypt, Exodus 9:8. And then a shower of meteorites flew towards the earth. Our planet entered deeper into the tail of the comet. The dust was a forerunner of the gravel. There fell a very grievous hail, such as has never been in Egypt since its foundations. It's kind of interesting that since its foundations, I wonder if they also mean that it happened before back in the day. That's interesting. Huh. Stones of Barad, here translated hail, is, as in most places where mentioned in the scriptures, the term for meteorites. We are also informed by the Midrashic and Talmudic sources that the stones which fell on Egypt were hot. This fits only meteorites, not a hail of ice. In the scriptures, it is said that those stones fell mingled with fire, Exodus 9:24. the meaning of which I shall discuss in the following section, and that their fall was accompanied by loud noises, rendered as thunderings, a translation which is only figurative and not literally correct, because the word thunder is wrong, which is not used here. Interesting. The fall of meteorites is accompanied by crashing or explosion-like noises, and in this case, they were so mighty that according to the scripture narrative, the people in the palace were terrified as much by the din of the falling stones as by the destruction that they caused. The red dust had frightened the people, and a warning to keep men and cattle under shelter had been issued. Gather thy cattle and all thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hailstones shall come down upon them, and they shall die. Exodus 9:19. And he that regard not the word of the Lord had left his servants and his cattle in the field. Exodus 9:21. Similarly, the Egyptian eyewitness, cattle are left to stray, and there is none to gather them together. Each man fetches for himself those that are branded with his name. Falling stones and fire made the frightened cattle flee. Iper also wrote, trees are destroyed, no fruits, no herbs are found. Grain has perished on every side. That has perished which yesterday was seen. The land is left to its weariness like the cutting of flax. In one day, fields were turned to wasteland. In the book of Exodus 9:25, it is written, and the hail, stones and barad, smote every herb on the field, and brake every tree of the field. The description of such a catastrophe is found in the Visuddhimagga, a Buddhist text on the world cycles. When a world cycle is destroyed by wind, there arises in the beginning a cycle-destroying great cloud. There arises a wind to destroy the world cycle, and first it raises a fine dust, and then coarse dust, and then fine sand, and then coarse sand, and then grit, stones, up to boulders as large as mighty trees on the hilltops. The wind turns the ground upside down. Large areas crack and are thrown upwards. All the mansions on earth are destroyed in a catastrophe when worlds clash with worlds. They actually say that straight up. I mean, what do you want, right? The other cultures literally is telling you worlds versus worlds. They're not playing games, right? But then they'll be translated as, well, it means some sort of figurative, whatever. No, okay. Anyway, the Mexican Annals of Cahuatlan, sorry guys, describe how a cosmic catastrophe was accompanied by a hail of stones. In the oral tradition of the Indians too, the motif is repeated time and again. In some ancient epic, the sky rained, not water, but fire and red-hot stones, which is not different from the Hebrew tradition. So at the end of this section, Velikovsky, not only does he... So here we have Velikovsky backing up the So if a large comet the size of a planet was indeed coming close to Earth and it's shedding its tail, right, its coma, then we would expect to see a lot of the stuff that was described here. And since it's planet side, we're also going to get, not just little bits of meteors, not little dust particles, but we get boulders the size of huge trees. And that's exactly what we would expect from a large cometary body, right? You're not just going to get little small meteorite fragments that just kind of burn up in the atmosphere. You're going to get rain down on. And what's even more interesting is that you get all of it. I mean, they describe all of it. Everything comes raining down on them, and it's all hot. Notice how you're not seeing any volcanoes, by the way. So at this point, what mainstream people do, they instantly just say, oh, a volcano must have exploded somewhere. And then you ask, well, where's the volcano? And they're like, maybe this one over here, whatever. And then they'll try to get, their geologist friends to come over to try to back it up with whatever magical volcano exploded back at this point in time with no proof, with no proof. They'll try to throw radiocarbon dating at you. Trash, garbage, completely, that's not nothing. Then they'll try to use dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is also a whole load of garbage. We'll talk about that in a separate video, but the problem is we have no good way of dating, like really anything when we start to go back thousands of years. Everything gets really messed up. So a question we could ask Velikovsky here, for example, is how do we know for a fact that all of these documents from across the world, or all of these recountings, let's stick with that term, all of these recountings that you are attaching to this date, how do we know for sure that these are describing the exact same event? So, and there's stuff that we can do to go try to prove it, and he'll do that, and other people have done it. But the problem is, once you try to do that, we also see that there's also other issues, and those issues stem from a very simple problem. If we have had multiple interactions with multiple celestial bodies, how do we know for a fact that what each civilization is recording 100% matches up chronologically to the way that, for example, Velikovsky is putting it? Because chronology is a pain in the patookie, so to speak. This is my issue now, is trying to get everybody lined up, because it's hard to prove what chronological order things necessarily happen. It's like there's great scholarship that really does a good job of showing that, like, for example, the Old Testament was written after the New Testament. That's just kind of a funny anecdote, but there's all kinds of things like that in history once you start dealing with chronology. And since a lot of the people in this arena ignore chronology, and they use a lot of the mainstream data. They try to use, the mainstream Egyptian Kings List / timeline situation, which is horrible. The Egyptian timeline is absolutely horrible, but I believe Velikovsky utilizes that as well. So these dates are up for grabs. I'm using the 1500s because he does. That this is his point of view, but even he admits that this may be wrong, or this is probably wrong. I forget where he does that, but he doesn't say this is rock solid. So credit to him. All right, I've talked enough. Let's move on. All right, this next section gets very interesting, and all right, now this next section is very eye-opening and interesting. Let's see what you think about it. This section is called naphtha. Crude petroleum is composed of two elements, carbon and hydrogen. The main theories of the origin of petroleum are: 1. The inorganic theory. Hydrogen and carbon were brought together in the rock formations of the Earth under great heat and pressure. 2. The organic theory. Both the hydrogen and carbon which compose petroleum come from the remains of plant and animal life, in the main form of microscopic marine and swamp life. The organic theory implies that the process started after life was already abundant, at least at the bottom of the ocean. And just for fun, I went to go check to see what theories are still getting played around with. And sure enough, those two are still the competing theories. How do you like that, though? We don't actually know where oil comes from. Right now, to this day. We talk about oil like it's already been figured out, like we understand everything. No, but just go do a quick, this is science. Science still has no technical idea where oil comes from. That's why this chapter gets very interesting. Let's go on. The tails of comets are composed mainly of carbon and hydrogen gases. Lacking oxygen, they do not burn in flight. But the inflammable gases passing through an atmosphere containing oxygen will be set on fire. If carbon and hydrogen gases or vapor of a composition of these two elements enter the atmosphere in huge masses, a part of them will burn, binding all the oxygen available at the moment. The rest will escape combustion, but in swift transition will become fluid. Falling on the ground, the substance, if liquid, would sink into the pores of the sand and into the clefts between the rocks. Falling on water, it would remain floating if the fire in the air is extinguished, before the new supplies of oxygen arrive from other regions. The descent of a sticky fluid, which came earthward and blazed with heavy smoke, is recalled in the oral and written traditions of the inhabitants of both hemispheres. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Mayas, narrates, "It was ruin and destruction. The sea was piled up. It was a great inundation. People were drowned in a sticky substance raining from the sky. The face of the earth grew dark, and the gloomy rain endured days and nights. And then there was a great din of fire above their heads. The entire population of the land was annihilated." Now, this is important because Velikovsky, while he is recounting what the Popol Vuh says in this case, a history recount, he is not talking in some sort of religious or historical sense. He is talking in scientific notation. He is talking about what would happen if a flammable liquid came into Earth's atmosphere, was introduced to our oxygen levels, and if you could light it up, which wouldn't be hard since everything is hot, you would have literally fire raining from the sky. This is scientifically possible. And then we see it being recounted in an ancient document like the Popol Vuh. Very hard to ignore. Very hard to ignore. But when was the last time you ever thought oil came raining down from the sky from space? Right? You've probably never thought about that unless you were already into this stuff. But there you go. This is completely possible. There's nothing in science that says what he just said couldn't happen. That's amazing. And that means that we have to take this perspective seriously. All right, let's go on. The manuscript Quiche perpetuated the picture of the population of Mexico perishing in a downpour of bitumen. Bitumen is like oil and tar and stuff. There descended from the sky a rain of bitumen and of a sticky substance. The earth was obstructed, and it rained day and night. And men ran hither and thither, and were as if seized by madness. They tried to climb to the roofs, and the houses crashed down. They tried to climb the trees, and the trees cast them far away. And when they tried to escape in caves and caverns, these were suddenly closed. Absolute destruction going on. A similar account is preserved in the annals of Cuauhtitlán. The age which ended in the rain of fire was called Aquihe Tonotuhua, which means the son of fire rain. And far away in the other hemisphere in Siberia, the Volgals carried down through the centuries and millennia this memory. God sent a sea of fire upon the earth. The cause of the fire they call the firewater. Half of a meridian to the south, in the East Indies, the Aboriginal tribes relate that in the remote past, Sengel Das, or water of fire, rained from the sky with very few exceptions. All men died. That's another thing I want to point out, is that when these events are going on, you have to understand this is earth-shattering, literally, and it happens. This isn't something where, like, a few people die. We literally lose entire civilizations in this. And guess what we find in the archaeological record? Lots of civilizations that suddenly die. This kind of an event, well, this is definitely one of the events, but there's these kinds of events are what takes care of these civilizations. The eighth plague, as described in the book of Exodus, was Barad, meteorites, and fire mingled with the Barad, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Exodus 9:24. There were thunder, correct loud noises, and Barad, and the fire ran along the ground. Interesting, yeah, because that's what would happen when it splashes on the ground, right? It would run along the ground on fire. The Papyrus Ipuwer describes this consuming fire. Gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. The sky is in confusion. The papyrus says that the fire almost exterminated mankind. The Midrashim, in a number of texts, state that the naphtha, together with hot stones, poured down upon Egypt. The Egyptians refused to let the Israelites go, and he poured out naphtha over them, burning blisters. It was a stream of hot naphtha. Naphtha is petroleum in Aramaic and Hebrew. The population of Egypt was pursued with strange rains and hails and showers inexorable, and utterly consumed with fire. For what was most marvelous of all, in the water which quencheth all things, the fire wrought yet more mightily, which is the nature of burning petroleum. In the register of the plagues of Psalms 105, it is referred to as flaming fire, and in Daniel as river of fire or fiery stream. In the Passover Haggadah, it is said that mighty men of Paul and Lud were destroyed with consuming conflagration on the Passover. In the valley of the Euphrates, the Babylonians often referred to the rain of fire, vivid in their memory. All the countries whose traditions of fire rain I have cited actually have deposits of oil. Mexico, the East Indies, Siberia, Iraq, and Egypt. I mean, that's amazing, man. That is absolutely insane. You ever think about that? Do you ever think that maybe the oil we're tapping into, not all of it, but some of it actually rained down on Earth fairly recently? Now there are other things we can discuss, and there are potential problems that we can bring up in reference to that question, but we'll take care of that later. Isn't that a fascinating thought, though? There's literally no reason technically why oil could not have rained down on Earth. And sure enough, all the places that say that oil rained down on Earth, all those places have oil. Yeah, man, it's crazy. Absolutely insane. Alright, he continues. For a span of time after the combustive fluid poured down, it may well have floated upon the surface of the seas, soaked the surface of the ground, and caught fire again and again. For 7 winters and summers the fire has raged. It has burnt up the earth, narrate the Vogels of Siberia. The story of the wandering in the desert contains a number of references to fire springing out of the earth. The Israelites traveled 3 days' journey away from the mountain of the law-giving, and it happened that the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. The Israelites continued on their way. Then came the revolt of Korah and his confederates. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up. And all Israel that were round about them fled at this cry of them. And there came out a fire from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. When they kindled the fire of incense, the vapors which rose out of the cleft in the rock caught the flame and exploded. So basically, if we're going to make the claim that oil rained down on parts of Earth, there better be effects of oil hanging out there for a little bit. And sure enough, once again, we have all these histories from around the planet saying exactly that. And they say exactly what would happen if oil was there. Right? I mean, if you don't know about oil, which a lot of people would assume basically most of these cultures did not know about, why are these guys literally having problems with oil catching fire everywhere? Like literally oil doing what oil would do given the circumstances. Like these are not like people calling out to their gods or doing anything. These are people just trying to like exist and live their life and do stuff. And there's oil in places that literally gets in the way and ruins everything. Absolutely an amazing perspective to think about. Unaccustomed to handling this oil, rich in volatile derivatives, the Israelite priests. Unaccustomed to handling this oil, rich in volatile derivatives, the Israelite priests fell victim to the fire. The 2 elder sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, died before the Lord when they offered strange fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. The fire was called strange because it had not been known before, and because it was of foreign origin. Space. Damn. If oil fell on the desert of Arabia and on the land of Egypt and burned there, vestiges of conflagration must be found in some of the tombs built before the end of the Middle Kingdom. into which the oil or some of its derivatives might have seeped. We read in the description of the tomb of Antiphocr, vizier of Sesostris I, a pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, a problem is set upon us by a conflagration, clearly deliberate, which has raged in the tomb as in many other. The combustible material must not only have been abundant, but of a light nature, for a fierce fire which speedily spent itself seems alone able to account for the fact that tombs so burnt remain absolutely free from blackening, except in the lowest parts, nor are charred remains found as a rule. The conditions are puzzling. Look at that, they even have evidence. That literally explains the problems with the tombs being burned low to the ground. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. And what does natural history tell us? Asked Philo in his On the Eternity of the World, and answered, destruction of things on earth, destructions not of all at once, but of a very large number, are attributed by it to two principal causes. The tremendous onslaughts of fire and water, these two visitations, we are told, descend in turns after very long cycles of years. When the agent is the conflagration, a stream of heaven-sent fire pours out from above and spreads over many places and overruns great regions of the inhabited earth. The rain of firewater contributed to the earth's supply of petroleum. Rock oil in ground appears to be, partly at least, star oil, brought down at the close of the world ages, notably the age that came to its end in the middle of the second millennium before the present era. The priests of Iran worship the fire that came out of the ground. The followers of Zoroastrianism or Mazdaism are also called fire worshippers. The fire of the Caucasus was held in great esteem by all the inhabitants of the adjacent lands. Connected with the Caucasus and originating there is the legend of Prometheus. He was chained to a rock for bringing fire to man. The allegorical character of this legend gains meaning when we consider Augustine's words that Prometheus was a contemporary of Moses. Torrents of petroleum poured down upon the Caucasus and were consumed. The smoke of the Caucasus fire was still in the imaginative sight of Ovid 15 centuries later when he described the burning of the world. The continuing fires in Siberia, the Caucasus, in the Arabian desert, and everywhere else were blazes that followed the great conflagration of days when the earth was caught in vapors of carbon and hydrogen. In the centuries that followed, petroleum was worshipped, burned in holy places. It was also used for domestic purposes. Then, many ages passed when it was out of use. Only in the middle of the last century did man begin to exploit this oil, partly contributed by the Comet of the time of the Exodus. He utilized its gifts, and today his highways are crowded with vehicles propelled by oil. Into the heights rose man, and he accomplished the age-old dream of flying like a bird. For this, too, he uses the remnants of the intruding star that poured fire and sticky vapor upon his ancestors. That's the end of this section, but there is a lot of amazing stuff right here. So one of the things that we can also think about is oil usage throughout history. We know that old cultures did use oil for various purposes back in the day, right? That's kind of like an anecdote that somebody will kind of say like, oh yeah, those people used to use oil and whatever, right? And you just kind of hand wave it and you think they're dumb. But we know cultures did use oil. But what Velikovsky points out is that there's a time when, yes, cultures did have access to oil because it was right there. It was on the surface or very easily accessible right underneath it. Nobody was drilling because you didn't need to. It was right there. Then, once all that oil eventually burns away or is used up by people, more than likely burned away, and then, of course, absorbed into the earth, people don't have access to it anymore. And that's exactly what we see in the historical record. We see a time period where people did have access to oil and they used it, and then it goes away. And Velikovsky points this out. So this little section in this chapter is amazingly eye-opening, because now we have scientifically, and we're talking in science here, not craziness, you have the possibility of oil raining down on Earth from space, hydrocarbons, interacting with the peoples on Earth, and having all the peoples on Earth that survive carry on the story of what happened. So we can't ignore our ancestors' stories that talk about rains of fire. And now, especially since we now have an idea of where that fire probably came from, now we can start paying attention to their stories and taking them more serious. That way, I mean, and once you do that, you're going to find all kinds of crazy stuff that is now true in their old quote-unquote myths and legends. Suddenly, those aren't myths and legends anymore, right? Now they're just histories. And now we have to deal with things differently. Now this opens up a whole other can of worms, and this video's gone on long enough, so we'll call it here. But just do me a favor, go out there and use your critical thinking skills and apply them to older historical contexts of back in the day cultures, thinking now about firewater, Venus rushing by Earth, raining down naphtha, right? Everything changes that way, and think about it scientifically. Don't BS it. You use critical thinking and think about it scientifically. Breaking yourself out of the mold is going to be tough, because it's everything I just said and everything Velikovsky said, if you're classically trained, is tough to swallow. But nothing that was just said can just be brushed off. There is science behind it. All right, I'm losing my voice anyway, so that's it for this one.